So when you think of stupid NBA trades, you might think of the James Harden one, the other James Harden one, or the other Brooklyn Nets one when they traded for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. Team loves to give away their entire draft capital at any given moment. But there is one trade that is very commonly forgotten about for no reason. Now, I just found out yesterday after I loaded up 2K10 for the first time, and I say the first time because I actually went to 2K11 when I was a kid. I didn't play 10. And I was looking at the Clippers and I'm thinking, man, what if this team didn't trade their pick? Now, who do you know who they traded their pick of? Kyrie Irving. They traded Kyrie Irving for cap space back in 2011. Now, let me break this down, right? Now, actually, let me say this first. I never realized that they traded Kyrie Irving for cap space. I just went back and looked through all these articles after doing this yesterday, and I'm like, this is one of those. Now, listen to the date I'm about to say. In February of 2011, the Los Angeles Clippers traded Baron Davis, their first-round pick that year, for Mo Williams.
What?
This saved them $11 million in cap space, which was a decent amount around the time. But that team, I'll put their record up on the screen, was already garbage. They were going to be a top 10 pick bound team regardless. Now they go to create cap space, and this is before, by the way, which we'll get back to in a bit, they traded for Chris Paul. This is before trading for Chris Paul. They had Blake Griffin, great scorer Eric Gordon, especially at the time, and DeAndre Jordan, like Chris Kaman was still around, but they trade their top 10 pick for $11 million in cap space. Now, as a child and everything, or growing up an NBA fan, especially not being a fan around that time, I always assumed that it was because, oh, maybe Mo Williams was better. I actually forgot which side got which player, but I'm like, oh, either one was better that they got, or they did it 2 years earlier. They didn't realize the detriment. Like, for example, Knicks stupid GM Isaiah Thomas, yes, Pistons legend Isaiah Thomas, in 2002 traded the Knicks 2010 first-round pick for Stephon Marbury, which ended up becoming Gordon Hayward, who's been like in the NBA for the past 13 years, and an all-star before his ankle snapped in half. So sometimes you don't realize the detriment years in advance, especially around that era. They weren't as highly coveted when it comes to draft picks. Teams were a little bit dumber. Nowadays, there's more repercussions and things of that nature. But they traded the pick that became Kyrie Irving 2 months before their season was inevitably ending. Now, that pick was expected to be around the 8 range, which is, you know, what they jumped up from. The pick jumped up from 8-1 for the Cavaliers. They got very lucky, but nonetheless, that draft did have Kawhi Leonard, Klay Thompson, Jimmy Butler. Kemba Walker was the pick after 8, so you could have just drafted him. Now, doing this information made me stumble upon the information. Who the hell was the GM of the Clippers when they made this trade? Well, it just so happened to be Neil Olshey, which you might have heard his name if you are a Portland Trailblazers fan, or maybe you just watched my Damian Lillard series when I was impersonating his voice for the sake of creating a character. Neil Olshey, right after his Clippers stint, went to the Blazers for 9 years, or 10, or something like that. He was the man who, sure, great picks, Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, but also didn't build a supporting cast around them for the next decade and lost the entire team in 2015 and traded for Yusuf Nurkic and did nothing else. That's what Neil Olshey's legacy in Portland was. But then this made me think about Portland, because I realized the Damian Lillard trade for okay, let's go further back just in case you don't know what I'm talking about. The reason why Damian Lillard is a Blazer as of today, might get traded within the next month, but is because they actually traded Gerald Wallace, who was on the Blazers, for the pick from, ironically, who I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the Brooklyn Nets, or New Jersey at the time, maybe still. It was around the time they were moving. They traded Gerald Wallace for the pick that became Damian Lillard, basically. But that wasn't Neil Olshey. He was still with the Clippers. That was Chad, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, Buchanan, whatever the hell Buchanan will say.
Buchanan.
Chad Buchanan was an interim GM. Interim means like, oh yeah, he just got brought here because the other dude got fired. This guy was the director of college scouting. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like whenever I see a GM become the interim GM, it's because they were the assistant GM. But he was the director of college scouting and became the GM of the Blazers for a year and traded for Damian Lillard in that year, or at least the pick that became it. He didn't make the pick. Now, the reason why Chad was the GM of the Blazers for that year was because this dude named Rich Cho got fired from the Blazers, and Chad had to pick up his slack for a year. They were in a 377-day search before they got Neil Olshey. So Chad was there for a whole over 365. Now, Rich Cho, immediately after getting fired from the Blazers, went to the Charlotte Bobcats. And he was the one who sure drafted Kemba Walker, but drafted Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, gave Nicholas Batum all that money, had the 7-59 season, although he didn't, that was his first year, so he couldn't really change that. It wasn't too hot in Charlotte, and he eventually got fired in, I believe I saw 2018. Back to the Blazers now. After Olshey got hired by the Blazers after that year of Chad, running the show, which, by the way, one of the weirdest things I've ever read, the Clippers released a statement saying that they had agreed to a deal for Neil to extend his contract in LA. And then just Just a few days later, they announced they had parted ways and he went to the Blazers. So what's crazy is they weren't even trying to get rid of him after the Kyrie Irving trade. Neil was over there doing damage control, talking about how their record was the reason that they got all this stuff. And the crazy thing is, the second Neil got into that office, Chad, the other GM, went back to his normal role. He went back to college director of scouting, college players, whatever it was. And you know when he left that role? When he got hired to be the assistant GM to Rich Cho, the dude whose job he took in Charlotte in 2015. I swear to God, I felt like I was going through the Twilight Zone looking through all these articles yesterday, piecing together everything. Now, like I said, Rich Cho ended up getting fired in 2018, but Buchanan, while Rich Cho was still the GM, got another promotion. He got hired by the Pacers as their GM in 2017. Originally, when I was doing this research and I saw director of college scouting, I worked backwards a little bit because I saw director of college scouting trades for Damian Lillard. I look up his name and I was so shocked to see that it says GM of the Pacers, just full on GM. And he has been in that position since 2017. He's obviously been an integral part of them trading for Victor Oladipo, was fantastic before the injury, trading for Domantas Sabonis, now having Tyrese Halliburton. Done some pretty good moves in their post-Paul George era, from director of college scouting to Pacers GM, all from one move. Now, this is where it gets even weirder. The Illuminati just keeps going. Kevin Pritchard is actually the president of the Pacers. Now, if you don't know, for example, I'm going to just give my Knicks out there as an example. Actually, Leon Rose is the president right now, the former head of CAA, which is a big agency, but most people don't come from that type of background to be a president. He is the president of the Knicks. He holds everything over everybody, whereas Scott Perry has been the GM for the past 6-7 years under Steve Mills and now Leon Rose. Scott Perry actually did just resign from being in the job, or like, I don't know, parted ways or whatever they want to call it. But all in all, that means that Leon Rose has more authority than Scott Perry. So Kevin Pritchard has more authority in Indiana than Chad. Kevin Pritchard was the GM of the Blazers right before Rich Cho, Chad, and Olshey. They all are somehow connected. It keeps going back. There's like a big thing going on between, what is it, 3-4 teams? The Pacers, the Blazers, and the Bobcats. And even more weird information, I just keep finding weird stuff that I never knew. In 2010, Pritchard was fired for Rich Cho to be hired, but he was fired on the day of the NBA draft an hour before. Which means that he had to do the draft. They told him, we need you. You have to make these picks, but you're done after this. He didn't do anything too crazy though. The Blazers were good that year in terms of record. Traded for Luke Babbitt, if you care. I also found it interesting to even further the link of GMs. This man, Kevin Pritchard, once traded Sean Marks, who has been the GM of the Nets for the past 7-6 years. I just found that interesting too, or actually, I think he's maybe the president now. He's been there for a long time. Now, let's go back to the Clippers, right? Obviously, I got off into a huge tangent of GM insanity because I feel like this is the interesting stuff that people don't talk about. Maybe you'll appreciate this information. So the Clippers draft comes around. They traded their pick unprotected. Neil Olshey's talking about, oh, I had to trade the pick. We needed the cap space. All right, bet. There's the thing. I think I did mention that, of course, they traded for Chris Paul. Now, here's the thing. The Chris Paul trade could have happened without the cap space. Chris Kaman, Eric Gordon, and Al-Farouq Aminu went for Chris Paul. Salaries matched up perfectly. We'll get back to the downside of that trade in a second. With their $11 million of cap space they created, they signed Chauncey Billups and Caron Butler. Caron Butler was a solid small forward for them for 2 years, good shooter, stretching the floor, whatever. But he only stood for 2 years. It wasn't worth losing Kyrie Irving for. Chauncey Billups played 20 games and tore his Achilles. Don't think that was worth it either. I understand at the time, especially because damage control was fully done by the new GM, and we all kind of forgot about the Kyrie trade since, because the Clippers ended up being one of the more iconic, I would still say, teams of the first, half of the 2010s. But I read this article about the Chris Paul trade, and it's funny because in hindsight, sure, we don't look back and be like, oh no, they lost a ton for it. But back then, people were very, very scared, or at least this one article I'd read, the dude was like, they gave up a pretty decent amount. So Al-Farouq Aminu was a top 10 pick the year previous. He wasn't panning out too crazy, but still ended up being a pretty solid NBA vet for the next decade. Ironically, was a good player for the Blazers when Dame had nobody else except for Rodney Hood and Maurice Harkless and CJ and Nurkic. Maybe a little Enes Kanter action off the bench. Then you got Chris Kaman. He still strung together a few decent years, but honestly, no complaints there. Just a salary filler. He strung together a few more double-digit years. Could have been solid for the Clippers still, but nobody's causing a ruckus because of the Chris Kaman loss, especially like 8 years into his career or whatever. Lastly, they traded Eric Gordon and a pick next year, the 2012 draft from the Timberwolves. Now, in this article I had read, it is a lot of concern from the guy that Eric Gordon at the time was one of the best scorers, young scorers in the league, and he was scared that Eric Gordon would be a top 15 scorer for the next 10 years. That's what was surrounded around the energy of this Chris Paul trade at the time. Instead of just drafting Kyrie Irving, who would end up becoming one of the best point guards himself and hell has a championship, although shout out to LeBron. Now, Eric Gordon, I won't say he was a top 15 scorer, but honestly, if we're speaking logically, he's been averaging 17 plus points around that for the past 10 years. So he has to be at least top 20, top 30, right? I don't know if maybe he is top. I'm not even thinking correct. Sure, a lot of his points came off of feeding off of James Harden because of, just shooting threes from the hash mark half the time, like a 2K sharpshooter.
Bam, bam, bam. That was sweet to see.
But prior to that, when he was with AD at New Orleans, he was a pretty great scorer even then. I remember actually going to a game once. And the second thing in the article is that the Wolves pick was expected to be top 5. It ended up being 10th. So they got a little bit lucky on that. And it was Austin Rivers who had went to the Hornets with AD, if you remember correctly. So with that being said, in this long string of GM insanity and trade insanity and player insanity, somehow looping the Damian Lillard trade into this, trading away your top 10 pick for cap space with 2 months left in the season that is going to be a top 10 pick is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of in my entire life. And arguably one of the worst trades in NBA history. Like, there's not even really a benefit to it. Who the hell are you gonna, you signed Chauncey Billups' torn Achilles, who by the way was already 35 years old. It's not like he was, a spring chicken. The Knicks had just amnesty clause his contract, which I haven't seen anybody use since. I don't even know if that still exists. And Caron Butler was already 33 years old. So it's like, you built a solid core around Chris Paul, but you didn't know at the time how the hell that was gonna happen. Hell, if we're being honest, he should have been a Laker. So yeah, that's a good way to end it off. Probably gonna make more videos on this channel of just me talking about basketball. I've been getting into my nerd bag recently. I was watching Dylan Brooks' defensive highlights the other day. Don't talk to me. All right, it's been real. It's been fun, but it ain't been real fun. Shout out to Michael Beasley. Toodaloo.